goes on to say, this mongrel jargon of the border is naturally shocking to the ears of the well-read Mexican. Skipping over a few other quotes that are more or less neutral in tone. Odón Betanzos Palacios, who is the president of the Spanish North American Academy, which is a corresponding member of the Academy in Spain, has some serious reservations. He says, for example, again quoting in translation, Spanglish is only a temporary means of communication. I believe that those who promote the teaching of Spanglish are not aware of the huge mistake in teaching this jargon that cannot even be understood in neighboring communities. And he concludes that Spanglish is a transitory problem and things will return to normal as successive generations of Spanish speakers in the U.S. recognize and appreciate the blessings of being bilingual. The self-declared admirer and promoter of Spanglish, Ilan Stavans, whose outrageous imitations and prolific popular writings on Spanglish have made him a lightning rod for polemic, initially defines the term innocently as, quote, the verbal encounter between Anglo and Hispano civilizations, unquote. His anecdotal accounts, however, of learning Spanglish upon arriving in New York City from Mexico reveal an often less than affectionate reaction. He says, but to keep up with these publications, referring to Spanish language newspapers in New York in the 1980s, was also to invite your tongue for a bumpy ride. The grammar and syntax used in them was never fully normal, e.g. it replicated, often unconsciously, English language patterns. It was obvious that its authors and editors were Americanos with a loose connection to La Lengua de Borges. Adopting an anti-imperialistic stance and considering Spanglish to consist primarily of use of Anglicisms by Spanish speakers, the distinguished literary critic Roberto González Echeverría laments the negative implications of Spanglish. A few comments, again in translation. Spanglish, the language made up of Spanish and English off the streets and introduced into talk shows and advertising campaigns, represents a grave danger, and this was in bold print, for Latino culture and the progress of Latinos in mainstream America. Those who tolerate and even promote it as a harmless mixture don't realize that this is not the relationship of equality. The sad truth is that Spanglish is basically the language of poor Latinos, many of whom are illiterate in both languages. They incorporate English words and constructions into their daily speech because they lack the vocabulary and training in Spanish to adapt to the culture that surrounds them. Educated Latinos who use this language have other motives. Some are ashamed of their origins and try to blend in with everyone else by using English words and literally translating English idioms. They think this will make them part of the mainstream. Politically, however, Spanglish represents a capitulation. It stands for marginalization, not liberation. Again, you can look later at other comments that sort of give you a sense of the spectrum. An interesting website devoted to the teaching of Spanish to Americans defines Spanglish quite differently. Quote, an entity that is not quite English, not quite Spanish, but somewhere in between the language spoken by an English-speaking person when attempting to speak in Spanish. Finally, the president of the Spanish Royal Academy, as always trying to get the last word and just have as few words as possible, simply says, quote, Spanglish is not a language. A researcher, Acosta Belén, observes that, quote, speakers of the non-defined mixture of Spanish and or English are judged as different or sloppy speakers of Spanish and or English, and are often labeled verbally deprived, alingual, or deficient bilinguals because supposedly they do not have the ability to speak either English or Spanish well, unquote. Milan, in 1982, specifically recommended that researchers and educators in New York City refrain from using the term Spanglish and use instead neutral designations such as New York City Spanish. However, recent work by Ana Celia Centella in New York City has demonstrated that younger Puerto Ricans in New York and other cities of the Northeast, at least, are beginning to adopt the word Spanglish with pride, refer explicitly to code switching. She says, and I quote, contrary to the attitudes of those who label Puerto Rican code switching Spanglish in the belief that a chaotic mixture is being invented, English-Spanish switching is a creative style of bilingual communication that accomplishes important cultural and conversational work, unquote. Spanglish has even made its way into children's literature. For example, in a humorously didactic novel by Montes 2003, in which a Puerto Rican girl is teased by her English-only classmates. The cover blurb sets the stage. Maritza Gabriela Morales Mercado, Gabi for short, has big problemas. Her worst enemy, Johnny Wiley, is driving her crazy. Gabi is so mad she can't even talk straight. Her English words keep getting jumbled up with her Spanish words. Now she's speaking a crazy mix of both, and no one knows what she's saying. Will Gabi ever make sense again, or will she be tongue-tied forever? And then you read the book, and actually has very little to do with any of that. The book provides a touching lesson in cultural sensitivity and a few examples of realistic code switching, Although the idea that bilingual speakers jumble up their languages when they become angry is unlikely to score any points in the bilingual education arena. Drawing together literary, cultural, and political views, Ed Morales, a literary critic, takes a politically grounded stance, linking Spanglish with the notion, and I quote, Latinos are a mixed-race people. There is a need for a way to say something more about this idea than the word Latino expresses. So he tries Spanglish. There is no better metaphor for what a mixed-race culture means than a hybrid language and informal code. The same sort of linguistic construction that defines different classes in a society can also come to define something outside, a social construction with different rules. This represents the most eloquent manifesto of Spanglish as an originally derogatory term that is being co-opted by its former victims as a badge of pride and courage, thus joining such crossover soulmates as Chicano, queer, and in another time and place, hippie and free. While it's my fervent hope that the term Spanglish will eventually lose all its negative connotations and soar with the LAVIS, less flattering notions still prevail and form the basis for the ongoing polemic that has cut across all sectors of Spanish and English-speaking societies. So you can see that there are very few common threads in what Spanglish may be. You have at least the following entities that have been considered Spanglish at one point or another. First, the use of integrated anglicisms in Spanish. Next, the frequent and spontaneous use of unassimilated anglicisms. Third, the use of syntactic calques and loan translations. Fourth, frequent and fluent code switching. Fifth, deviation from standard Spanish grammar found among vestigial and transitional bilingual speakers with more passive competence than active competence. Next, the characteristics of Spanish written or spoken as a second language by millions of Americans of non-Hispanic background who have learned Spanish for personal or professional motives. And finally, the humorous, disrespectful, and derogatory use of pseudo-Spanish items in which anthropologist Jane Hill has called junk Spanish. The research questions that emerge are at least the following. Who uses Spanglish and in what circumstances? When and where is Spanglish used and not used? Is Spanglish a language distinct from English and Spanish? Can Spanglish be characterized technically as a jargon, a pidgin, or a Creole language? Does Spanglish have native speakers? If so, are there monolingual native speakers? Does Spanglish have a common linguistic core understood and used by all speakers or listeners? And do regional or social dialects of Spanglish exist? Clearly, I can't get to all of those in the next 15 or 20 minutes, so I'll hit on just a few of those. I'll leave out things outside of the United States, the use of cyber Spanglish, which is pretty much anywhere you find Microsoft and Espanol, you'll find stuff in Spanglish. I should mention that the one place where almost everything that I say here will also apply is Gibraltar, because sociolinguistically it's almost exactly the same situation. Spanish is the preferred language of most of the population, but officially it is absolutely English only. So let's talk just briefly about code switching. When two languages come into contact in a situation of stable bilingualism, both borrowing and code switching are normal events. Many observers have claimed that borrowing during language contact is constrained by a quasi-universal hierarchy of elements, with content words such as nouns being the most frequently borrowed, while functional words and so forth are at the opposite end of the spectrum. More recent research has revealed that a priori hierarchies or typologies of grammatical elements susceptible to borrowing are so riddled with exceptions as to be meaningless in a global sense, although within a given language family they may work. The relationship between grammatical structure, comparative typological hierarchies, and sociolinguistic factors is nowhere better exemplified than in intrasentential code switching among fluent bilinguals. Code switching, at least of the fluent sort, is governed by a complex set of syntactic and pragmatic restrictions. Among the former, the most compelling is the requirement that no grammatical in either rule be violated. Rule in either language be violated. And in particular, that the point of transition be more or less smooth in the sense that the material from the second language is in some way as likely a combination as a continuation in the first language. Fluent code switching may therefore produce combinations, for example, in which a switch occurs between an article and a noun, between a complementizer and a subordinate clause, between a conjunction and one of the conjuncts, etc. This again, English and Spanish, which have very similar superficial syntactic structures. The restrictions reflect the general need to maintain the grammatical rules of each language, following the linear order both in English and Spanish, and also to retain easily parsable chunks of discourse.